Okay. Um, to begin with, I want to tell you that I'm a septuagenarian first-time author. I wrote the book because I feel a mission. And the mission is that I don't want people to walk around and think that all European Jews went like lambs to the slaughter, which is believed by a lot of people who are terribly naive about it. Because in the first place, you have to understand that there wasn't the slightest chance to do anything about it. In our preliminary chat, we discussed the fact that it was a country that Austria was a country of 6 million, of whom a good many were still suffering from the depression, which was at least as bad as it was in this country, except that I think people were actually starving. And that makes pretty good material for a Hitler who comes along and promises you jobs, efficiency, grandeur, in fact, to own the world, which is what the song said, the national anthem of Germany. Today we own Germany, tomorrow the whole world. Okay, they meant it. There used to be a discussion whether they meant it or not. They actually never dwelt upon this before, but the discussion was, did they say, tomorrow the whole world listens to us, which is a very similar word in German, or did they say tomorrow the whole world belongs to us? I'll let you guess which one they were really saying. Well, I was a 16-year-old kid at that time, when it all began to happen. And I was part of a liberal, assimilated family. I was a good Boy Scout. I had been a Boy Scout ever since I was 8 years old. And that was, of course, an international idea of pacifism, of higher ideals, of kids getting independent. Not like Boy Scouts in this country where the fathers are the scout leaders. Our scout leaders were older boys of about 18 or 19, and we camped out a lot, and we hiked a lot, and it was a great way of spending one's time. There was a degree of anti-Semitism, but it was like you heard an ethnic joke. And the Austrian attitude, which was always much more easygoing, a big difference between Austria and Germany, was what the Austrians called Gemütlichkeit. It's an easygoing way of life, not a hard-nosed, striving way of life. And we thought that the sort of thing that went on in Germany couldn't possibly go on in Austria. And so when the Nazis acted like skinheads do in this country now, the Austrian attitude was ignore it. Don't make martyrs of them by punishing them. Don't do anything extreme. It'll go away. It won't happen here. That was a very dangerous attitude, because it did happen eventually. We heard what was going on in Germany. We didn't quite believe it. We thought they exaggerate. We thought the Germans always exaggerate. Well, it did happen in Austria. And it happened in Austria with a sudden brutality unlike the one in Germany. So that what really happened to us was that because of the brutality, some people wanted to leave the country immediately over the nearest border, not knowing which direction was the best, because who knew? And others said it can't happen here, and waited. That could easily kill them, and did kill a lot of people. There were 4 sayings that killed people, I maintain. One was, it can't happen here. The next one, when it did happen, was, it can't last here. The world will not permit it. England, France, Russia, America, Italy will come to our aid. Guess what? Nobody wanted to go into a war. The next My sister, who was 18, wanted to leave the next day. My mother said, no way. Where would you go? What would you do? My home is here, the family is here, our friends are here, our living is here. Where would we go? What would we do? So then my mother said one of the other sayings that was dangerous. We leave together or not at all. Killed a lot of people. And ultimately, she said the last saying that killed a lot of people. If it gets really bad, we can always leave then. Because whoever dreamt of the idea that somebody would actually set out and start murdering people wholesale, murdering Jews, certainly, murdering political opponents or people who were suspect of possibly being political opponents. It didn't matter whether they were or not. If you're not for us, you're against us. If you commanded an audience, if you were active in the Masons or in the PTA, or if you are active in anything at all, if you were a Boy Scout leader, you might command an audience and influence people to give trouble to the Nazi regime. Therefore, you were incarcerated and later systematically killed. If you were homosexual, you were targeted to be killed. Even earlier than the Jews. If you were a gypsy, you were targeted to be killed. So you see, there were a whole bunch of people on the list. And to rise up against this kind of armed power was A, technically impossible, and B, it didn't occur to people because of the things I've said. It can't last. All right. We finally realized that it was time to get out. I was harassed on my way to school. The school was run in such a manner that in my school, they didn't kick out the Jews right away. But the Jewish students were allowed to only occupy the first floor of a 3-story large school building. We were allowed to use only one entrance. Some of the teachers wore Nazi uniform. Some of the kids that went to the upper floors wore Hitler Youth uniforms and were ambushing some of the kids who were in our classes. And we had some girls who came from another school who were put into our class along with us, so that now a class designed for 30 had 60 people in it, with kids sitting on the floor. Teaching became impossible, and we were afraid because we heard they were trying to ambush the girls in our class. So, being naive and new at all this, we armed ourselves with steel rulers and escorted the girls to the streetcar stop so that nobody would harm them. It shows you how naive we were, because we thought at that time we still could do something about this. We fought back, as it were. Not for long, because if 6 guys beat you up and you limp to a cop on the corner, he would say, oh, you're a Jew. That's perfectly all right. They can beat you up if they want to. Anybody who put on an omelet with a swastika, not belonging to anything, not being a party member, just an opportunist, could knock on your door and help himself with anything that was inside. They were looking for weapons and propaganda material, traitors, high treason material that you might be storing. So what they were looking for was jewelry and money and whatever they could get a hold of in your automobile. And they got away with it. I was chased by Hitler Youth and would have been beaten up if it weren't for the chance passerby of a man in blue coveralls carrying a long galvanized pipe, and he probably was an employed worker who was not a Nazi. And when he saw the Hitler Youth guys who were twice my size jumping me and beating me up, he put his pipe down very gently and then jumped the Hitler Youth guys and gave them uppercuts right and left and said, pick somebody your own size and get the hell out of here before I beat you up. And that worked, and it was amazing. and very satisfying, I might say. The trouble is the Hitler Youth boys knew where I lived, and happily we moved to my grandfather's, and they didn't know where I lived for a period. Well, it was getting progressively more difficult to get out. Very, very difficult. You had needed papers, and you needed to sign papers that said, under oath you swear that you are just going on a short vacation and you're coming back. And you had to sign another paper that said, under oath, you were leaving the country and you were never going to come back. So you were perjuring yourself automatically, and if they wanted to pick you up on that, they would. But they didn't have to pick you up on anything. They just arrested people. And if they arrested you in the beginning, you would hear that somebody had been arrested, some friend had been arrested. And you would say, why? Not for long, you asked why. Because it was a joke, a black joke. And people said, well, he ate scrambled eggs for breakfast, that's why he was arrested. But that joke stopped when when an urn arrived in the mail, which the Nazis did in the beginning, and on the urn it said, shot while trying to escape. Now, these were people, I assure you, who were not shot while they were trying to escape. They were killed, they were murdered. Before it was the system of the country to murder people, which it became, of course, as you all know. Now, this systematic murder, I think, is in a class by itself, because whereas I have assured some of my Afro-American friends that I concede the point that if you are running away from a lynch mob, it doesn't make any difference whether this is a state policy or the policy of some lunatics who want to beat you up. To you, it doesn't make any difference. The end is death. But I say it puts it in a class by itself because it was the official policy of that country, of the Nazis, to murder people. And I cannot believe, and my wife and I talk about it almost daily, it somehow gets into the conversation, how did anybody get people to murder people? What would it take to make you murder somebody? An order? A threat? I mean, would you do it if I ordered you to do it? Would I do it and had the power to punish you if you didn't? I would like to think that I wouldn't do it no matter what. And I don't know. But it's outrageous to kill millions of people, children, old people, women. Absolutely outrageous. Well, as I said, it got progressively harder to get out. My mother and my aunt were in fashion business together in downtown Vienna, and my aunt went to Paris every year to look at the new models. My mother, who was sort of her partner, said, why don't you go to London one time? And my aunt said, English fashions don't interest us, it's all tweeds and stuff, and we are more continental. And my mother said, yes, that's true, but we get English customers, why don't you go there once and look what they're wearing at home? And my aunt said, well, it's only a hop across the channel, I'll go. And she went, and somebody offered her a job in an Oxford Street department store. And she said, thank you, but no thank you, I have my own business, why should I? And this person said, well, you never know, we keep it open for you for a year. And that was in April 1937. On the 12th of March 1938, Germany marched into Austria. My aunt's business was taken away within days, and my mother's. My aunt wired London and said, I accept the job. And she went to London. Now, when you are a newcomer in London, the English, who are very reserved, ask you a standard question, which is, do you like it in this country? How are you enjoying yourself? And my aunt would start to cry. And she would say, how can I be happy here when my family is in jeopardy over there? And they would say, well, you came out, why don't you bring them out too? And she would say, I can't, but you can. How? Well, she said, it won't cost you anything. I'm saving my money so that I can finance their living expenses, and you can bring them out as domestics or as gardeners or as guests or as anything at all. And she barely ate a meal and saved all her money and brought out 14 people, among them my mother, my sister, and myself. My parents were divorced. My father had left the country immediately by trying to ski into Switzerland. The Swiss, as you may know, returned people if they found them and returned them to the nearest German frontier point where they were inevitably murdered. My father tried to ski into Switzerland, but he found there was so much army patrol activity on the German side that he skied down again on the Austrian side, and he managed to get onto a freight train to the border, and there he observed and looked for an opportunity to escape. And when he saw a class of small school children crossing with the border with their teachers, he noticed they weren't stopped. Apparently the border guards on both sides knew this class doing some activity on either side of the border, and that was an accepted practice. So he picked up a bunch of papers, put them under his arm, waved to the guards, and walked out among the school children, and it worked. He was lucky. And he hitchhiked to Bern, where his nephew was first tenor at the Bern Opera, and managed to evade the secret police who were on his trail. Rather, he didn't evade them altogether. He was arrested, and luckily, the tenor who had been on tour came back in time, and he said, "Let this man go, I guarantee for him, and he'll stay with me." And the Swiss listened to him, and he stayed there for a few months. Then he went to Belgium. He had no papers. He had left hurriedly. And in the meantime, we had gone to London, and my father wanted to get to England also, and of course they wouldn't let him in without papers. So he carved a bust of George Bernard Shaw. He was a rather imaginative, creative man, out of balsa wood, and mailed it to Bernard Shaw and said, can you please help me to get to where my children are in England? Bernard Shaw sent him a picture postcard of himself, and on it said, "Thank you for your spirited bust and your excellent letter. I cannot improve on it. I regret I have no influence at the Home Office, but I have forwarded your letter thither." This is my only heirloom from my father. I treasure it. It's probably very valuable, but I'm not going to give it away. My father then stowed away on a Polish merchant steamer under a heap of coal and got ashore when the customs and immigration people had left, and hitchhiked to the farm where I had in the meantime, through my aunt the milliner's good offices, become an unpaid farm hand. Unpaid, but they gave me board and lodging, and they toughened me up, which I came in handy later. So we were making hay, which you do in England when the sun shines, which is very rarely, and you do it even late at night, and it was getting dark, and I was working on this lovely farm, 17th century farm, called Frog Mill Farm, between Henley-on-Thames and Maidenhead. And I saw a man walking down from the Black Boy Inn on the corner, the pub, and I said, "Damn, looks like my father. Can't be, he's in Belgium." And it was my father. And he, like the Austro-Hungarian infantry officer he had been in World War I, he spectacularly threw off his jacket and said, "I help." And the poor farmer had a fit, because he already had one incompetent working me, and now he had two. And he had to invite my father to dinner he hadn't eaten in a day, and he was going to give himself up to the police afterwards. So the farmer had 9 children and a great big table where we had dinner, and my father nudged me and said, "I think I make speech." And I screamed, "No." I mean, I screamed in subdued voice, and it was too late. He was on his feet, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you for your hostility." And I said, "Wrong word." And he said, "Why? They're my hosts. Hostility." Well, after dinner, he gave himself up to the police, and he was held for a period, and then they let him go. They did not deport him. And everything went on reasonably happily until, I have to say, we were praying for war, because who was going to stop Hitler without a war? You couldn't negotiate with him. We pacifists were praying for war. In Britain, it was extremely alarming, because you saw double-decker training planes, Tiger Moth, and in Germany you saw contemporary bombers, Dorniers and Junkers flying over all day long, low enough so you could see the Nazi insignia, tanks rolling down the streets, tailgating each other, troops marching all day long, and in England you hardly saw a uniform. It was very alarming, and we tried to warn our hosts, and they said, at least the right of center press said, "Don't spread alarm and despondency. You ruin our relations with our good friends, the Germans. Keep quiet." Well, that was until war started, which was when Poland was invaded. Hitler having said after each invasion, "This is the last claim I have, and I have no territorial claims. I simply need some breathing space for my people who are being victimized." So when war started, the British were rather frustrated, because their expeditionary force in France didn't last long when the Germans outflanked the Maginot Line by going through Belgium and Holland, ignoring the neutrality of countries. And the British were now subjected to vigorous bombing, random bombing by German bombers. There were like 6 air raids a day, dropping bombs, and sometimes some bombs dropped without air raid warning. And people moved to the subway to spend their nights. I didn't. Many of us never entered a shelter and just tried to luck it out, as it were. But it was rough. And the frustration was immense. The British expeditionary force was salvaged by, and I remember that whenever I see a mariner like you do here, because everybody who had a small boat went over at Dunkirk and saved soldiers, picked them up, and civilians carried over what was left of the British Army. Enormously courageous, really. And then, in order to do something, they said, "How do we know these aliens are not all spies? Let's intern them." Like the Nice in this country. And we were interned. And they shipped 2,000 to Canada and 2,000 to Australia without convoy. They couldn't afford warships in wartime to guard transportation of aliens. The Arandora Star, a ship on the way to Canada, was sunk by a U-boat and lost with almost all hands, and a lot of children who had escaped from the Nazis. It's just appalling. I didn't make it as far as Australia or Canada. I got as far as the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea, and after 2 months there, my mother managed to get me sprung from internment on compassionate grounds, because she had an operation, probably a hysterectomy, but nobody used words like that in those days. And she had worked in millinery, and one of her customers was a niece of Viscount Samuel, who was the chief Girl Scout of Great Britain. And this lady sent a telegram to the commandant of my internment camp and said, "Please release Peter Arani. He has been a Boy Scout for many years and is thoroughly reliable. and his mother is having major surgery and she needs him on compassionate grounds. Poor man in charge of the camp had no idea what to do because nothing like that had ever happened, but he didn't want to incur the wrath of all the Girl Scouts of Great Britain when he offended their leader, and so he let me go temporarily, and I had to report to the police in London. And then they forgot me out. They got busy with the war, I guess. And I got a job, and everything was fine until they remembered that they had left me out finally, after all, and they came to, Scotland Yard came to re-intern me, but I managed to tell him that the age limit for the army had in the meantime been lowered to 18, and I was just 18, and so I enlisted immediately. And I found myself in the Pioneer Corps, which was called the Auxiliary Military Pioneer Corps. And it was a labor unit unloading trains and testing bridging parts. And we had no rifles at first, and then they gave us First World War rifles, but no ammunition. And it was rather pathetic. And I volunteered for everything that came down the pike and never even got an interview. Until finally, one day I came from the depot where we worked, and there was a little notice on the bulletin board, typewritten, and it said, anyone wishing to volunteer for special and hazardous duty, come to the office at 2 o'clock. And I went, and there was an officer in disguise, with no rank insignia and shades, which no officer in the British Army wears, unlike the American Army. And he asked me four questions. The first one was, why do you want to do this? And I said, I lived under the Nazis for 6 months. Do I have to amplify that? And he said, I understand. And then he said, can you shoot? Do you know anything about radio? And can you handle a boat? And I said, I know nothing about radio. I have paddled my father's rubber canoe, and as for shooting, I'm pretty good with a BB gun. That seemed to be good enough. And I was sent to London to a hotel with about half a dozen other people. I want you to note here that one guy who, when he was asked why he wanted to do it, he said, I've always been interested in cloak and dagger type stuff, and he was out immediately. He was not acceptable. He didn't want romantics, they wanted realists. In London, we were cross-examined by military intelligence, and having learned afterwards how to cross-examine in interrogation of prisoners, I can tell you they did a good job. The interrogation method was very, very good. They would say, what does your father do? And you tell them, and they would say, and what is your political orientation? And I would say, I'm a guest in this country. It doesn't behoove me to participate in politics as a guest. Oh, quite, of course, you are quite right. And what newspapers do you read? And I'd say the Times, the Telegraph. And they would say, and what does your father do? And you'd say, I just told you what my father did. Oh yes, of course you did. And what did you say your politics were? And I said, I just told you. Oh yes, of course. And that would go round and round until you felt, well, I don't really have anything to hide, and perhaps they think I'm stupid if I don't notice that they're asking me the same question over and over. So you gave them a straightforward answer, which is all they wanted to hear. And the next thing, I was shipped off to North Wales, the Cambrian coast on the west of Britain. And when the little train pulled in, there were a crowd of guys in green berets, because we had no idea what we volunteered for, those of us who had volunteered. Nobody told us. And there we were, surrounded by Green Beret guys saying Commandos on their shoulder flashes, and some of them had parachute wings, badges, and it was very exciting because some of them we recognized. They had disappeared previously from the labor unit, and they hadn't been allowed to communicate with anyone. So we had lost touch, and they introduced themselves because they all had new names. I was told I had to change my name, we'd be called in alphabetically, and I had 2 minutes to think of a new name. And I decided to keep my initials, and I was, having been born as Peter Arani, I was going to be Peter Arlen. And I said, I got it, I'm going to be Peter Arlen. And I was the second to be called in because the first one was Abramovich from Vienna. And Abramovich came out and said, gentlemen, let me introduce myself. My name is Richard Arlen. And I said, you bastard. You stole my name. And he said, oh, that's right. I said, you heard me say that I'm... He said, exactly, you don't have to explain. I heard you say, and I liked the name, and they called me in first because Abramovich comes before Arani. He said, you want to make something of it? And I said, no, because he had been telling me that he had been a finalist in the welterweight junior championship in Brussels. And I said, it's all right. The name didn't bring him any luck. It now lies buried in Normandy. He was killed almost immediately. He was enormously courageous. He charged the German position single-handedly after having tried to negotiate their surrender, and they shot at him, and he got mad and grabbed his Tommy gun and charged. And they didn't miss. We all were considering ourselves lucky to have the opportunity to fight back, because we knew of the millions who did not have that opportunity. So this troop was made up entirely of refugees from countries that did not have governments in exile. The French had a government in exile and an army in exile. The Poles had an army in exile, the Norwegians, the Dutch, the Belgians, but not, of course, Germany, Austria, Hungary. So we were mainly German, Austrian, Hungarian Jews, and some political people who had obvious reason to fear for their lives immediately. And we were now trained physically as commando soldiers, the elite of the British Army, and the training was extremely tough. And it became a standing joke. The toughening process continues. There was no falling out unless you fainted. You hoped you would faint, but guess what? You don't faint very easily. You are exhausted, you carry on, you're still carrying on. Then one day, it was particularly strenuous to do a speed march of 7 miles to the hour with full equipment, weapons and ammunition. And if your bad luck was to draw one of the heavier weapons, like a flamethrower or something, that was pretty tough going. And the skipper got furious because he was a very calm man and he rarely smiled. The skipper being the Welsh captain who in disguise had interviewed me. He spoke absolutely accent-free German and French. He was a double language major in Cambridge. He was a tremendous athlete and would do everything first. He never asked anybody to do anything that he didn't do first. In fact, we got leery of making a joke, as was customary in the beginning, where you would march along and there would be a sheer wall going up several stories high, and some guy would whisper, "Don't let the skipper see that wall or he'll make us climb up and jump down." And if he heard it, he did exactly that. And before he made you jump down and climb up and jump down, he would climb up to show you how easy it was to climb up a sheer wall without any holds whatever that you could detect. And then he would jump down. And if you think, I'm just saying that, let me say that he jumped 15, 20 feet. And it became a routine. You simply did it. And you jumped where you couldn't see where you were going to land. And therefore, when he saw people faint, he said, if this were real, would you leave your comrades behind? You wouldn't. You would bring them along. So from here on out, if anybody faints, you bring them along. Well, you're already carrying your load and your weapon and your ammunition. So what we did in self-defense, when we saw people faltering, we would take their weapon and carry an extra weapon rather than having to carry the guy. So then that would usually was good for maybe a quarter mile or half a mile. And then they would falter some more. So we would try and take the pack. But this was hard going. So then we would take the guy in the middle between two guys, take his wrist over our shoulders and say, pedal your legs for God's sake, because we can't drag you when you don't lift your feet. It's too hard. And the guy, if he was at all conscious, would move his legs a little bit. And that was good for a quarter mile at the most. And then the guys who were doing the towing needed to be towed themselves because they couldn't. It's just unbelievably exhausting. It all paid off. When we got into action, there was an occasion, for instance, where an outpost ran out of ammunition, and somebody had to crawl up to that outpost and carry ammunition to them while crawling. Guess who did it? Our guys, because they had been through this stuff, you see? The skipper was a vivid mountain climber, rock climber, and he could not comprehend that there were people who did not love climbing sheer rock faces. So one day he lined us up at the bottom of a rock face and he said, is there anyone here who does not really love climbing these rocks? And there was some tittering in the back rows, and he got very stern and he said, I'm serious, because if there are any of you here who don't really enjoy this lovely sport, I want them to climb with me today. Are there any volunteers? And everybody's hand went up because everybody wanted to climb with the expert, because it was reassuring. And he knew those rocks like he knew his pocket. And he would climb above you where he couldn't see you. And he would say, you are entering a very difficult area now, so reach out and you will find a handhold just big enough to get 2 fingers into it if you stretch your right hand a little farther than you think you can. And it worked. I was one of the lucky ones. I got picked to climb with him that day, and I'll never forget it. It was amazing. I did things I didn't think I could do. Some guys went on raids. We all had not only changed names, but changed cover stories. The army dog tags were imprinted Church of England. And we learned everything about the German army. We learned their methods, their documents, their organizations. I had fold-out charts of how a German SS Armored Division is organized, and I had to learn this. And we learned German dialect, army dialect, because we spoke fluent German, but we didn't know some of the army dialect. 4 guys went to Sicily, all were very badly wounded. 12 guys went to Italy. 1 was killed and several were badly wounded. 1 lost a leg. My first action was D-Day, Normandy. And we landed on the extreme left flank on Sword Beach, and I was attached. We didn't work as a unit then. We were attached as specialists to British commandos. So I was the only one attached to the bicycle troop of number 6 Commando. We landed by sea, not by parachute, although we were qualified parachutists. The way we became parachutists was this. We were moved to a new town in England nearer the coast, ready for D-Day. And the skipper said, when I dismiss you now, I want you to get your kit off the truck, which has preceded you here, and go to your private billets. We always lived in private billets. Citizens put us up as part of the war effort. We had no barracks because we had no staff. Everybody was a trained assault soldier. So he said, get your kit off the truck. And by the way, is there anyone here who does not volunteer to jump out of an aeroplane by parachute? If so, raise your hand now. 2 guys had the courage to raise their hand. Everybody else volunteered. The 2 guys were Laddie and Webster. That was their assumed name. Laddie was Lewinsky from Vienna, a ballet dancer, and the nephew of a famous actor. And Webster was the son of a guy who owned the biggest, the Toys R Us of Vienna. His name was Goldstein, I think. Laddie said he suffered from vertigo and he had a very good reputation in the troop as a daredevil, and so nobody resented his not wanting to parachute. Webster said he promised his wife never to parachute, and that didn't go over well because the guys kind of sneered at that kind of thing. We were too macho for that sort of attitude. They were on one landing craft on D-Day, and neither of them made it ashore. The landing craft was hit, and Laddie and Webster were both killed. You can talk about appointment in Samara, if you will, or the fact that fate is predestined, but we lost 2 guys, one very good, one not so good, but they were as dead as anybody else involved. I landed with the bicycle troop of number 6 Commando, and the big thing was to get off the beach, and the skipper had told all of us to see that we were properly used. And he said the commanding people for whom you will be working will be busy and preoccupied with their other duties. And don't you come back and tell me that you didn't get used. See to it that you make a pest of yourself. Keep volunteering, that you know what to do. So whenever the captain to whom I was attached wanted a runner, a messenger, a patrol, I volunteered. He inevitably said no. And he used the people with whom he had previously been in the desert, whom he trusted and knew, rather than me. Then we cycled over the last hill before we came to the bridges over the Orne River and Canal, which was our vital first target, to relieve the airborne who had landed there in gliders and by parachute and were waiting for relief from the sea, us. As we went over the crest of the hill, the lead cyclist was killed by machine gun fire. And the captain of that unit looked said, deploy, take cover behind the hill, and everybody got off the bikes and pushed and hid behind the hill. And then he looked around and he said, now, Lance Corporal Masters, here is something you can do. I want you to walk down to the village to see what's happening. Well, I could tell him what was happening. They were shooting from the village, you know, I mean. And I said, yes, sir, which is what you say in the British Army. And I said, how many men do I take on this reconnaissance? And he said, nuh-uh, just you. And I said, yes, sir. And I said, I will, there was no cover, there was no ditch. I said, I'll work my way around the left, and please look for me, all going well, to return around the right, which is how I had been trained to do this sort of stuff. And he said, I think you still don't understand what I want you to do. I want you to walk down the road to see what's happening. And now I understood perfectly. And I could sympathize with what he was doing, because he had to. He had to get on. Our next target was Varaville. If you look at the map of Normandy, that was farther inland than anybody got on D-Day. And he needed to draw fire, because he hadn't seen where the fire had come from that had killed the lead cyclist. So he wanted to draw fire. Now, it was perfectly human to want to send the guy who had just been attached to him, whose value he not yet appreciated, than to send one of his own guys. So he sent me. So off I went, and I had a distinct feeling that I'm mounting the scaffold to the guillotine. I mean, there was simply no way. Why wouldn't they shoot me like they just shot the cyclist, right? I mean, it's obvious. But I had been trained to improvise and to think of a better angle, and I thought feverishly, because I actually reflected. I said to myself, all this good training going to waste now because I'm going to get killed right away. And I suddenly remembered, you know how the mind is a computer and something suddenly flashes up when you need it. I remembered a movie I had seen. It was Commando, where the British in the previous war are fighting on the Khyber Pass, and Cary Grant and Errol Flynn are coming upon 2,000 insurrectionist rebels in some ruined castle, and they were going to be louder. On the Khyber Pass in India, a bunch of revolutionary Indians were plotting some coup, and Cary Grant and Victor McLachlan, I think, and Errol Flynn come upon them, and Cary Grant delivers a very funny line, I thought, just before they all jump on him and tie him up in tight knots. He says, "You are all under arrest. You are all under arrest." I'm being upstaged by the music. Anyway, I shouted, "You are completely surrounded," in my accent-free German. "Surrender, come out with your hands up." And nobody did. But nobody shot me because they were waiting to see what was going to happen. I feel that I have been extremely lucky and privileged all my life. Lucky to get out from under the Nazis, lucky to be able to get into England, lucky to be able to join the forces, which I wanted to do very badly in order to fight back. Lucky to get into an elite unit like the Commandos of this very special nature. Lucky to have survived it, because many of us did not. Without a scratch virtually, except a little grenade splinter in my behind in training, because I was getting a little casual about it. Lucky to write my first book as a septuagenarian and have the first publisher accept it. Lucky because Miramax bought the movie rights before the book came out. The people who made English Patient and Pulp Fiction, and they want to make a feature movie. All this is surely incredible luck. So I appreciate it, and I thank you all for coming to listen to me, and I hope that I have succeeded in demonstrating that not all stories told by Jewish refugees from the Nazis are stories of victimization. Although there are many and they are valid and they are all different, I think it is good to know